Welcome everyone to today's info session with Flame University. I'm Shantanu Kishwar and I'm a teaching assistant with the Department of Social Sciences. So in today's session, you will be interacting with both faculty and students from the Department of Psychology. Now, the goal of the session is to better acquaint you with the psychology program at Flame University. In the normal course of things, we'd have had you come to the university and interact with students live. But since that's not going to be possible, obviously, in current circumstances, we are trying to do our best to make up for that. So today, we have with us on our panel professors as well as students, and um, Professor Sairaj Patki will begin by introducing the psychology program at Flame, after which some of the students will be talking about the particular topic of the new normal of our digital lives. Now, the goal of this is to give you an understanding of what your learnings of psychology might look like in a few years, and the competence that you can achieve as a psychology student at Flame. When you go through the program. So yeah, Professor Sairaj, can you please begin proceedings?
Thank you so much, Shantanu. A very warm welcome to all who have joined us today. And we would have really loved to look at your faces and not the thumbnails, but we all know that's how it has been for the past year. So, like Shantanu said, this is, I think, a good platform for us to get to know each other and have that first platform of interaction. It's a platform for you all to get to know your seniors. And I know this is not exactly the kind of informal platform that you would have liked with professors being here. You would have probably liked to meet the seniors, but that will happen in due course of time. But we have some of the most wonderful students in our class from Psych today. And this is not an exaggeration. This is, not just to make them feel happy, but this is the truth, and anybody would vouch for it. So the idea of this is, first of all, let's not call it a webinar because we have been listening to webinars and we have been participating numerous ones of them for the past year. So as I said, it's more of a platform for interaction. It's more for us to get to know each other, the kind of philosophy that we follow in the program at Flame, and what are the different kind of views that our students would like to share with you, right? So it's not about a professor talking to the students. It's more about your peers, probably a year or two senior to you, talking about their views, their experiences. How did they link what they've learned in class to what their life experiences were, and how that has unfolded into understanding of this digital life of ours, right? So we were talking about the new normal, and we thought that let's talk about this before that new normal becomes a known normal, because all the terms that we have been using, lockdown, pandemic, it's been exactly a year, and probably we are bored of these terms. But with the new rise in cases, it seems like we are kind of better equipped now to look at it in a different perspective. And that's the entire journey that we will try to cover through this session today, moving from how we first reacted to it and in terms of how did we deal with it, right? So it's not going to be a session wherein we will tell you how to deal with stress, how to deal with anxiety. It's not a session wherein we're telling you what's to be done. It's just a platform of interaction wherein we are sharing our views, our insights, and our passion for the subject. And not just a subject of psychology, but how these students have kind of combined that with their passion for their minor, their open minors, their other subjects that they're studying, and getting a more holistic idea of what these experiences have been rather than just looking at it in a singular lens. Right. So we also have with us Professor Priya Nair, who heads the department, and it's wonderful to have all of you all, and we hope to see you all soon. So without spending more time into the introductions, I'll just quickly like to tell you who the speakers for today are going to be. So I'm Dr. Sairaj Patki. I've been with Flame for over 3 years now. I teach subjects of abnormal psychology, experimental psychology, besides the others. And but the focus will be on the other speakers today. So we have Muskan, who will be going first. She's a third-year student who has a major in psychology and has an open minor exploring economics. She's a very active in her academics as well as extracurriculars. She's been working with Wage Indicator as well. After that, we have Robin, who will be also having an open minor. So he has psych major and open minor. And he's been exploring courses in human resources as part of his open minor. And finally, we have Preeti, who has a psych major and a dance minor. And she will be speaking about her experiences and her journey throughout the course, and how dance and psychology and dance have come together. Yeah. So over to you, Muskan. I think that's it from my side, and I'll probably pitch in wherever I feel like, but the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, sir. And also for the compliments. That felt really nice. So, as you all already know, I'm Muskan, and I'm really excited to be here. I often think that the disciplines that I have taken up at Flame are always at loggerheads with each other, because psychology has a very specific way in which it regards human behavior, and economics has a very opposite way of looking at behavior. So, what I want to do today is to just kind of bring out my passion for both of these disciplines by talking about our massive shift to online shopping ever since COVID happened. So, to begin with, I just want to give a small brief about how it is that both disciplines perceive behavior, so that to set the pace for the rest of my talk. So, in psychology, we often look at the human being as a part of their social setting. So we are often guided with not just our rationality, but also our emotions, the people we are often with. So the stress is, as the human being a part of their social setting, a product of their social setting. But on the other hand, in economics, the view is that the human being is very rational, right? That any person always weighs the pros and cons and always seems to make the decision that gives them the highest pleasure. But we know that's not always the case. And of course, to some extent, there has been acceptance of that in economics, which is why there has been a lot of emerging fields, one of which is behavioral economics, as you might know, and it's very cool. So I'm going to dive in. I'm going to talk about COVID. Firstly, of course, it's a state of uncertainty. We don't really know much about what's going on. In the beginning, of course, because we did not have control over our environment and how things were going, we regarded it as a crisis, right? Apologies for the background noise. So we saw everything as a crisis. Now, what that did was that a very characteristic example of it is panic buying. You must have heard of this, right? A lot of supermarkets had items off their shelves in a minute after COVID happened. Like people were just going crazy, buying things, stocking up so many things in their homes. Now, usually that is prompted by our need for survival, because when we get more resources, we do feel a lot more secure, and we do feel like we have some control now that we have resources. So I want to try to deconstruct the situation of panic buying by both a psychological perspective and an economic perspective. So I'll start with the popular opinion that panic buying is an irrational behavior, as it's often touted to be. Humans having the need to be in control, it's very difficult to approach things in a calm and collected manner. So often what people say are that you need autonomy. You need to feel like you're in control of your actions. You also need to feel like you're being relatable. You see other people buying things off their shelves, and you also feel like you probably should do the same too. You should have the feeling that you're doing something beneficial for your family, that you're doing the right decision, and also competence. The fact that you are able to go up there and buy so many things, it kind of validates your decision and kind of makes you feel like you're making the right choice. And of course, everything underlying this is fear, anxiety, and sheer panic, right? But a very unexplored side of it, of course, is the economics in panic buying, which I think is really cool. It can actually be looked at as a rational action. And I think it's really cool because it's very similar to how banks run, right? If you take a bank for an example and you don't have a deposit insurance, that is, if you give your money to the bank and the bank happens to fail, you won't get your money back. You don't have a guarantee of getting your money back. So naturally, any nervous saver will pull out their money from a bank if they see other people pulling their money out of the bank. If the bank doesn't seem to be strong enough, or it seems like it might fail soon, then you are very likely to take your money out of it. And I think that situation is very much like the panic buying situation. Because you did not know what was going on, the market itself did not give you any guarantee that you are going to have these supplies in the future as well. You did what any rational person would do. You went and swept the shelves off, right? So I think that's a very cool dichotomy, and that's something I very much get to learn. But without taking much time, I'm going to dive into the actual fun part of my talk. I promise you it is a little fun. I want to talk about how we've completely shifted to online shopping. And it's not just a need. I feel like very much like what our webinar says it to be, it is our new normal. I feel like once the COVID pandemic ends, we will still somewhat be sticking to online shopping in some manner, in some capacity. And I'd like to talk about a concept called nudging, which is actually when motivation and incentive kind of fails. So you need a nudge to kind of make people change their behavior. So a very simple example of that is you must have seen when you go to a restaurant or you go to a shop, you have circles already drawn on the floor to show you where you're supposed to stand so that you maintain distance from other people. These are called nudges. They make your decisions way simpler, making it a lot easier for you to actually comply with them. So I want to talk about a few things that people have done, that retailers have done in online shopping to make this shift possible. And I have fallen prey to it like a million times. So I think it's just funny and relatable because all of us, I think, are going through the same situation. So the first is free gifts. If you buy something and you get a free gift with it, we go ballistic, quite literally. So it's actually said that we have a very illogical approach when it comes to free gifts, and we tend to give them a value greater than they actually have. And we're actually more likely to take up a free gift with a purchase than we are to take a discounted item. Because in a discount, you're still technically paying for it. You're not getting anything for free. So the appeal of free is actually really, really huge. And this might be a better example, free shipping. If you buy something on Amazon and you don't have free shipping, you get annoyed. And it's a very simple trick because you know that you're going to buy the product you're paying for, but this is only implied when it comes to shipping. And you get annoyed that, oh, I'm paying for this product and I also have to pay for shipping. So having shipping free just makes life a lot easier. And it becomes even trickier when people say that you can have free shipping over a certain amount, let's say 2,000 rupees. It makes you buy things that you never thought you needed just for the tag of free shipping. So we actually tend to give a lot of value to free stuff than we realize. And I've done this millions of times. I mean, Amazon has quite pushed me to do the same. So another actually, you might know this, seasonal sales. You have lots of discounted items. I think this past year we have had constant discounts, lots of sales happening, people trying to get rid of their stocks. But it's really funny. You don't always just see the discounted price. You first see the original price, you see how much you're saving, and then you see the discounted price. And that actually really matters in whether you make your decision to buy the item or not. And this very simple trick is called the anchoring bias. It's called the anchoring effect, which is when the very first thing that you see becomes an anchor for the decisions you make as you go on. So when you see like a t-shirt that's for like 2,000 rupees, you're like, what? And then you turns out there's a discount for like 50%, and now you only have to pay 1,000. You compare, you can't help it, but you have to compare that 1,000 rupees with the initial price that you saw, making it a lot easier for you to end up buying that t-shirt, even though you wouldn't technically pay 1,000 to buy a t-shirt. I know I wouldn't, but if I saw that I was saving 1,000 by buying 1,000, I would actually end up doing that. These are very, very tricky things that it's really hard to miss. Okay, another thing, this is really cool. So add to cart is something that we don't get to do in real life, like in offline stores. It's very much an online phenomenon. You have the add to cart button and you can add as many things as you want in there, but you're not pressured to buy anything. In a store, the moment you put something in your bag, it's like you have the intention of buying it, right? What happens in online shopping is you don't have that pressure. So rather than asking you to buy something, you're getting into the mood of buying as you put things into your cart. And that itself pushes you to make more purchases than you usually would. And there's also a reason why it's called add to cart, not buy now. So those things have like a really big effect. In fact, colors also have a huge effect. I mean, for the same reasons that Paytm is splashed in different colors of blue, Amazon, if you've noticed, is also splashed in different colors of orange, because orange gives you a sense of urgency. You see these discounted prices, you see the stars, and you feel like, yeah, you want it, you want to buy it. And like a simple example would be, lots of fast food chains have some element of yellow, some element of red, always in their logos or in their stores. Like you have KFC, you have McDonald's, you have Burger King, you have Domino's. If you notice, all of them have a very similar color pattern going on. And that's because colors really matter. The red in all of these colors stimulate your appetite, even yellow does. If you have the color blue, which usually is used for payment and for Paytm, for Google Pay, if you notice all of these colors, blue gives you the sense of security and trust. And it's very much intentional. In fact, like colors are 85% of the reason why a consumer buys a product. And I've actually read this in a research paper. Yes.
It's actually a question for the participants. You can just try what she said, and you can identify how many of the restaurants, eateries use red and orange warm colors, and how many banks, you can just try and counting how many nationalized and private banks actually use blue. So that's a little homework for you all. Over to you, Muskan.
Yeah, I think that would actually work from the ones that I've seen so far. So I hope you have fun doing that. I was actually close to coming to an end. Actually, I just wanted to talk about all of these different things, and personally, I have fallen prey to this a lot. There are things that you just don't see, but they are in front of you, and psychology is a lot like that. You have all of these things in front of you, but you don't really see them and you don't really reflect on them. But it's after you know all of these little tricks and nudges that people have in place for you that you actually realize you're being tricked. And that is, I just wanted to say that's a lot like how online shopping is going now, because my purchases have risen like crazy lately. So I think this session has helped me a lot personally, because I've gotten to do some reading on it myself. But I was actually just coming to an end with that. That's pretty much all I have to say about online shopping.
Thank you, Muskan. I think the dilemma that you spoke about is very similar to what I experienced when I was at Ferguson, because economics was my second favorite subject. And my professor was really disheartened when I chose psychology and didn't take economics. Obviously, it was a very traditional format in which I could take either, in terms of it. And you're fortunate enough that you can balance both now. So this question always arises, when we start off talking about economics by saying that all other things being equal, and then you start talking about things, right? Whereas in psych, we start off by saying that everybody is different. So that contrast is something which, like you said, can be seen as contrasting subjects. But I think through your discussion and through your personal experience, what I'm realizing is for you, you're either on the side of being an empathetic economist or a rational psychologist, right? So you're swinging between these two polar opposites, and they're not opposites in that sense. You're bringing in your understanding of psych when you're looking at economics. So probably you have a different perspective when you think about your own shopping behavior. And at the same point of time, you're applying psych in terms of seeing how attention, perception, and those theories are panning out in terms of when we talk about color theory and color psychology and how that impacts, how branding works and how advertising works and how marketing works, right? So I think you'll somewhere figure out whether you want to be an economist who is empathetic or a rational psychologist, and or be somewhere in the middle, which would be more interesting. Yeah. So thank you so much for that. Anything that you would like to add, Preeti, Robin?
Nothing as of now. I mean, it was really fun. A lot of things even I learned just now about how corporations also get our attention. So yeah, a lot of fun. Very
So I guess even our
insightful.
attendees, every time now they're going to go to Amazon, they're going to think about Muskan first. So Muskan, you might get a hate mail from Amazon for it, but
Yeah, you blew their cover.
In fact, I was just thinking what all stuff I put on my Nykaa cart, things that I don't even need. I don't have hair. Where am I going to curl it and all that? I don't know.
Also, what does green signify if there's something for green color as well? Because I've noticed that the Starbucks, the logo of Starbucks is green. Is there any particular reason for that? Like that's like a different trend as opposed to other cafes or eateries that I've come across.
I agree. Actually, I don't know about green, but Starbucks also has black, and black signifies luxury.
Yeah.
It's supposed to, and it does put a lot of stress on ambience and the experience that you have on Starbucks. So, but
yeah, even the green is the darker green. It's more of black mixture with green. Right? It's not the typical one that you represent for environment or you represent for green being in terms of having more green behavior in that sense. Probably it's just the opposite.
So I had a question for you. So Muskan spoke about the anchoring and adjustment bias. We also studied in second year about various heuristics. But what happens when you study these? I don't think you automatically get adjusted to knowing them. Muskan said that still, when she looks at Amazon, her behavior is the same. So how long does it take for this behavior to progress?
See, first of all, we've spent around 18, 20 years of our life, interacting with these products, interacting with these platforms. And your course of 2 years, you're comparing that with your 20 years of upbringing and interacting with these things, right? So if you're following a typical behaviorist perspective of how learning, relearning has taken place for that, it's going to take time to unlearn and relearn something different, right? And the second aspect is also about being conscious about it. So, in a very traditional format, what we do is we learn for a semester and not for life. Whereas the actual emphasis should be on learning for life. It's not the exam where education ends. In fact, it's after the exam that it starts off. The exam is just a kind of a way of testing how much you gain from it, but it's about how you apply. So I think even at the end of the day, when people expect a psychologist to be all rational, a psychologist to be all empathetic, a psychologist to, have no issues, no stress in life, that's again like an unrealistic expectation. I mean, we are humans, we are bound to be pulled towards these forces that marketing agencies use. We're going to be, manipulated in some way by the way these things function. But whenever it's a question of making a formal choice, making a well thought of choice, are we conscious enough of what we've learned, and can we somewhere bring in that? Like I always say, some theories may not work, some theories will definitely work. It's about trying and exploring, having the trial and approach method, but somewhere down the line, having that conscious approach towards making decisions and then applying what you've learned would probably make you a better decision maker. I wouldn't say you would be completely immune of what happens, because then that wouldn't make you a part of the broader society that we are. but at the same point of time, you're becoming more conscious about it, at least aware, knowing that, okay, this is something that's acting upon. So when Muskan says that, yes, I know this is what has been happening with me, that awareness itself is the first step, right? I mean, we have a billion buyers who are indulging in these behaviors without even realizing that there are so many things acting out on it. So I think
The
that's the
experience.
first step to it.
Oh, sorry. The experience that I'm going to share also will be a great testament to the fact that just knowing is not like, sort of everything. Because yeah, I mean, despite knowing all of the strategies and theories and things of the like, you still take your time with processing any sort of like problems or any emotions that you're undergoing, and it's still a process. And yeah, I suppose it is quite like unlearning and relearning are some long processes that require its due time. So what I'll be talking about, I'll be talking my sort of structure would be much more anecdotal, wherein I'll sort of undergo my experience of uh, how it was like after everything shifted online, where Flame University had to shift to an online mode of education on the brink of the pandemic, and how we sort of came back home and in the middle of our exams, and started working that way. So I mean, it was pretty much like I like in the beginning I was sort of used to it, but then later on uh, screen fatigue and space related issues and living with your family members started getting to me as well. Oh, I'm so sorry. That's my cuckoo clock. So yeah, that started to get to me as well, and then afterwards it was even about balancing my household chores with my academics and things of the like. So basically, with all of the stress of the pandemic and not having time to spend with friends, and like sort of the whole notion of having the graduating year to be spent online, I found myself engaging in some form of emotional avoidance, where I would try to drown myself in co-curricular activities and club work, and some work that is related to the student newsletter. And I'll sort of keep interactions at a minimum, and like this was sort of how I believe all of y'all would have also faced it. Do pitch in, like, Sir, Muskan, Preeti, whenever y'all like sort of feel like, because there's
Sure,
pretty
sure.
much
Go
something
ahead.
that all of us have undergone, and all of us relate to. So yeah, this was pretty much what I was facing, and like my training in psychology though uh, helped me understand the feelings, like sort of, and the emotions that I was undergoing, and the things that I had to look at. I was I was firstly trying to just find like some silver lining in all of this, and trying to figure out how, amidst all the adversity, I can sort of find my way out and finish my commitments, and try to sort of keep my mental health level stable, and and things of the like. But then I realized later on that like wishful thinking and just hoping that, by waiting the problem will go away, that sort of does not work always. The emotional avoidance that I was talking about did give me some time to process my emotions and to come to terms with the fact that this change had happened, and that is pretty much every like all of us need. Although it is different for different people, every one of us sort of need some amount of time to process our emotions and to come to terms with the new reality. And whenever that happens, that is the time when we are able to sort of strive, like come back from it, and take the necessary steps uh, to fight and to like sort of work towards the solution. And that is basically the problem solving approach, which is something that I'd even learned in a class, which is set to have healthier outcomes. And when I found myself sort of engaging and becoming more of a problem solver than being detached. It was then that I could actually speak to my parents and actively help them out, and uh, even actively involve myself, like, instead of doing the bare minimum of what is required. Actually, even in the pandemic, with everything coming to a standstill, I could put in more effort. And all of this sort of boils down to what is known as locus of control, which is something that is like very, very interesting, an interesting concept that I've come across, uh, which sort of talks about how much do you believe like how much agency you think you have in the face of an adversity. So, speaking of locus of control, if you believe that you have an internal locus of control, it sort of means that you believe that anything that you do and all the actions that you make will have an impact on the environment. Every single thing that you do can, like, you have the ability to change the environment by your actions to suit your needs more, as opposed to having an external locus of control where you believe that you are the product and the victim of your circumstances. So after getting that space and that headspace to like finally come to terms with reality, I could push myself to have this form of approach, that is having an internal locus of control and believing that the things that I do actually have an effect on real time, and that I have to push myself to make things happen. But obviously, I'm not trying to indicate that all that I did, like from coming from a place of low productivity and like low levels of mental health, to a place of moderately good productivity levels, it's not something that I could achieve individually by my own effort. It is definitely a process that involves the people around you as well, which sort of brings me to certain certain strategies or certain nuances that are even involved in your people to people interaction. uh, Speaking of that, you can look at your own family also as an organization in itself, because organization in the end is just a collective of people. We make hierarchies and things of the like to sort of have a smoother flow and to have a more systematic. So in every organization there are some hierarchies, and that's why that's why, like, looking at home is like a very real time example that even y'all can introspect, because even there we have some people who have a little more, like, the parents would have a little more power than and a greater say in matters than you would. And like, it's a thing about discussion, and that's sort of where we begin with the organization. And what I realized was, for any organization to work smoothly, it requires a strong support from what I call the top management, or in the family situation, it would be the people who in the hierarchical sort of ladder is at the top. And for strong support from top management, there is like an open communication channel is essential. So going back to my experience where I was talking about being detached, that did not help anybody, because my being detached did not allow for an open mode of communication, and there was no feedback. And so, like, we couldn't work towards improving what was missing as a team. So being a team player in that sense becomes very important on both ends. It's a two-way process where people from the top management and you as a person who is working and implementing things, both of them should be on the same page with regards to where you want to see the organization go. That is, where do you want, like, what is your vision? And when you relate that to your family experiences, it is about what do you what do you expect from a family, what do you expect a healthy and a functioning family to sort of have, what do you feel it, how it should impact you individually, how the interaction should look like, and how your actions impact other people in your family. Because you have to be very clear on this, that anything and everything that you do affect the people around you. So keeping that in mind, an open way communication definitely helps both ways, where you can voice your concerns and even take feedback from others, and do what is necessary to sort of a balance of compromise, and uh, getting things so to sort of move everything forward. So that definitely goes on a long way, uh, and obviously not sticking to what is already done. You have timely review sessions where you keep sort of seeing where we are, and what strategies, what changes are required, and that sort of keeps propelling us forward on that direction. So in that sense, having a like it's quite similar to have uh, like a family and an organization. And on that end, I would like to sort of extend the conversation to y'all as well, to just to sort of see if the experiences that I've been sharing, in what level can you relate to it, and what have your experiences been with the pandemic, and how have y'all coped with the pandemic in that sense? I think this is something that I would like to hear a little bit from your side as well. If anyone, like
Yeah, I
sir
mean, the
or
audience can put it in the chat as well. But I was reminded of the HR concept of 360-degree feedback, right? We talk about a 360-degree feedback in HR. When we say that we have to be reviewed, our performance has to be reviewed by not just the superiors, but our subordinates and our peers as well. And that's the whole process. So I think this aspect of communication, when you bring it down to the family, it's exactly the same thing. That if you have a unidirectional communication flow which is coming just from the hierarchy or the management downwards without a feedback mechanism going back upwards, then that's where the failure comes into the picture, right? And I think, like you said, during the pandemic, we were functioning as an organization much more than before that, because we were confined geographically. So the different roles, the sharing of the roles, most places did not have the housekeeping coming in, so the roles were divided between us. And that restricted space, that uncertainty in the world outside, was kind of a competitive environment through which organizations are actually going through right now. So we are talking about the economic depression, we are talking about the competition growing, we're talking about downsizing for the organizations. I think your metaphor of bringing that to the family is exactly what happened during the pandemic. We, as an organization, as a family, were forced to face change, which even organizations find it difficult, right? There's an entire curriculum on change management in organizations. There's an entire way of assessing change and how organizations and employees are reacting to change, and bringing that to the family is something that we all explored. We tried a hand at baking, we tried a hand at cooking and cleaning dishes. Probably we realized that our aptitude is not all the great, in all the aspects, but that's how the reallocation of roles took place. And if the hierarchy has kind of understood that, if that feedback mechanism, if that communication has been open, I think as an organization we have reshuffled things, identified newer roles, newer aptitudes, upskilled ourselves. The way we talk about it in organizations, that you need to keep upskilling yourself, you need to upgrade your skills. You can't just be at a managerial level for all your life. You have to upgrade your skills to move on to the next level. You have to become a divisional manager, regional manager, then you're moving on to the pan India level. So I think that same concept of upskilling ourselves within the family, not in terms of competition, but in terms of making the unit function much more holistically, much more successfully. I think that's something that really makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's very cool and interesting to see how a family can be thought of as an organization, because ultimately it boils down to survival and maintenance in a pandemic. And what I also noticed with my family was that we were working against each other in the beginning, and that really doesn't help anybody, because I have to attend my classes, my parents have to go to work, online work, and my brother has to go to school, so there's no way out of it. But if we function better together, then it really makes sense. And Robin, I really liked your story and how you used your HR concepts here.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, that's sort of something that we all can relate to in that sense. So yeah, I'm quite glad.
I wanted to add one more thing actually. So, when you were talking about having reflected upon yourself and having identified that, okay, this is the situation and I need to get out of it, and you eventually did end up getting out of it. I often think to myself that identification and reflection is one thing, and actually being able to come out of whatever situation you have identified yourself in is one thing. Like over the break, I really tried getting into the habit of meditation. And I'll tell you, it was really difficult for me to do that. I had the motivation, I had the incentive, I had all of the opportunities set up for me. Like I have a quiet room. I have all of the opportunities before going to bed. I have the time, I can meditate. I have the resources to. But for some reason, manifesting the behavior itself doesn't seem as easy. Like it doesn't happen on its own. And even when you have all of the motivations to do that, it still doesn't always happen. So I was just wondering, I mean, did like Preeti, Robin sir, did you go through the same thing? I mean, having to I know Robin did. I mean, like, I'm just trying to ask that if you did think that you need to get out of a situation, how exactly did you do it? Like, how did the doing happen for you?
I mean, yeah, it just, yeah, that's actually sort of a very good question in the sense that I don't know, like it just sort of requires some leap of faith, I believe, that like no matter how much you reflect and how much you weigh the pros and cons, there is something that you will get out of actually going out there and trying it out for yourself. So maybe, like, if, like, let's say, like, if I want to start exercising or something, I can look online to see all the benefits of exercises and like pros and cons, and but then that will never give me the endorphin stimulated sort of experience that I will only get, that feel good experience that I'll only get after a good workout session. And that definitely comes with that leap of faith, that even though I know that while I'm doing it, it seems grueling and it doesn't seem worth it, but you know that at the end of the day you will actually feel better. So yeah, I had to sort of like, even though my primary tendency is to analyze everything and to try to sort of weigh the pros and cons of every single thing, in the end of the day I realize that I have to sometimes take a leap of faith with some things as well, because taking a leap of faith also leads me to insights later on that is only possible to see in retrospect and not something that you can anticipate beforehand. So yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
This leap of faith is what I would call data collection as a researcher. I mean, sorry for being that typical nerdy researcher kind of a person, but it's exactly what Robin said, right? I mean, you start off with lit review. You're trying to look at the pros and cons on the internet. You've done your lit review. Now it's actually time to test that hypothesis, and the only way to do that is by actually putting it into practice, right? I mean, either the hypothesis is going to be supported or not supported. You tried baking, it turned out to be a piece of charcoal, or it turned out to be good, right? Or somewhere in the middle. But you wouldn't know that unless you tried doing it. So I think being trained in research across the course is also something that may have somewhere at the back of your mind made you, think of it that, okay, this is a sort of data collection. I have to try it out. I have to experiment it out. I have control group and experimental group. And, I tried it out in batches, whether it was Sunday that things worked out, whether it was a Monday and therefore exercising didn't work. But, you try to look at the variables and then put it. You probably wouldn't do it in a very academic manner as this, but the thought process is something that is built. So I think that's what, whenever we talk about the courses that we learn, even in school, we many times say that trigonometry is something that I would have never used in my life. Geometry is something that I never use in my life. Why did we even learn those things, right? But I think it's a way in which the brain is exercised to think in an abstract manner, which not necessarily will be applied in that same format, but you're trying to applying it in different ways. So even this researching, right? I mean, as a cook, you're researching, you're trying to have different ingredients, you're changing your variables in that sense. So a cook is a researcher, a photographer is a researcher. You don't have to always look at it in an academic perspective. So I think that's something in terms of a metaphor that would work.
Right. I just have to dive in and do it. Right.
Yeah. Collect data.
Collect data.
Preeti,
And maybe try different types. I meditate myself, so I'll tell you, it takes a long time to get started. And meditation is very different for different people. For some people, it's a distraction. For some people, it's a way to address their thoughts. So the yogis that I go to, they tell me that, calm your mind and don't think of anything. But when I'm meditating, I'm thinking of everything. But it's just that usually it's that chaotic mind, but in meditation, the thoughts flow. So I know I'm taking one thought at a time. So yeah, maybe try some different, maybe guided meditations or something. Keep at it.
Thank you. I definitely will.
Okay. So thank you, Sairat sir, Muskan, Robin. It feels great to be interacting with faculty and seniors. I can vouch for the fact that seniors at Flame have been so helpful. And this whole setup is just taking me back to my orientation when I came as a prospective student, wondering, oh my God, I think I like psychology, but where am I going to go, I've read Freud and I know Skinner. Okay, I've looked at Freud memes, but where am I heading really? And now that, I can think of relating theories from, let's say, Lev Vygotsky or Carl Rogers into daily life, it really helps me. So when I think of the new normal, actually the old normal in terms of my academic experience was PCMB. Okay. Physics, chemistry, maths, biology. And the new normal in my house is psychology and dance. So it's very, very different for my family. I think my family has taken this time, including me, obviously, to think of what this combination really is, because a dance minor. So I'm a second year student and I'm majoring in psychology and minoring in dance. Now, dance in a Indian setup is thought of as a hobby, it's performance, it's something that you do when your relatives come over. So what do you mean you're taking a dance minor? My parents took probably the longest time to understand, and I think I understand their apprehensions, because before explaining it to them, I had to know for myself that, okay, all right, I understand there's some interest, but where am I really taking this interest? So that question from somebody, saying that they don't know which branch of psychology they want to do in the future, I was like that. I remember coming the first day and I told my senior, I'm a lost puppy, I don't know where I'm headed. So I know what I don't like. I don't like PCMB, but I don't know if I do like psychology and where is it going to take me. So this time in the lockdown was spent in navigating through the subject choices, navigating and understanding really where your interest lies. If I would talk about my combination of psychology and dance, I think of understanding and integration, balance and practice of the two disciplines. Now, when I say balance, it's about setting priorities. I had to ask myself these questions. Is psychology more important to you or is dancing more important? when I'm studying psychology, it feels like, oh, this is theoretical. I like dancing. But when I'm dancing also, oh, do I want to do this as a career forward? Maybe not, which is another thing that I'm going to talk about, that dance is not only for trained professionals, for trained dancers. A lot of children, a lot of people train as children, and I was not one of them. So I have done a little bit of contemporary before coming to film, but I don't have any formal training, which was again on my parents' mind, that you're going to take a dance minor. Do you want to be a performer? And I said, no, I like performing, but I don't want to do that as a career. So then how are you going to mix psychology and dance? And this is where integration comes in. So I started researching about dance and psychology. I started talking to my seniors, and I found out about dance therapy. So in the sense of balance, when I was saying that setting priorities, I remember I was giving this example to somebody, that if psychology, let's say, is my instrument, then dance is going to be one of the chords. So dance is going to be my specialization. How doctors, they will get their MBBS, and then they will branch out to dentistry and stuff. So just like that, I am thinking of branching out to dance therapy. And a lot of people have various questions about what dance and movement therapy is. I had them too. So dance is not only great for physical health, but also for mental and emotional matters. It gives you a unique space to share your emotions. A lot of people they don't like the traditional talk therapy. They're not good with their words, and they don't know how to portray their feelings in words. So this is where dance comes in. Dance can be extremely self-relieving. It improves self-esteem and confidence. And again, when I say dance, I think the better word is movement, because the activity you're doing is dance, but you don't have to be good at dancing or anything. It's just simple things that you do. Dance becomes a medium. So in talk therapy, my talking is the medium, and in dance therapy, dance is the medium. So just how you would, music itself is so powerful. So it can affect your moods and our state of well-being, just by, maybe taking us back to some memories or taking us back to some emotional experience. Hearing a song from our childhood can create a sensation in our entire body that instantly affects our mood. So dance therapy also sort of revolves on that it does have a physical side to it, where Robin was mentioning how there is that endorphin release when you do any form of exercise. But there is also that psychological insights that you get into your own well-being, Well, when I also first started learning about dance therapy, it just sounded very fun. Oh, maybe it's something that dancers do. But this form of therapy is open to all. And in fact, the more you read about it, the more you learn. So we in psychology, we speak about CBT and, psychodynamic theory a lot. So what happens is CBT and psychodynamic theory, they function on a top-down process, where they first engage the thinking mind, which we call the prefrontal cortex, right? So you first engage the thinking mind, right? Okay, I was just reading the chat. Yeah, you first engage the thinking mind, and then you move on to emotions and body. But with dance and movement therapy, it's the reverse. So it's a bottom-up therapy. And what that means is that the healing starts in the body. It starts soothing your nervous system, calming the fear response, which is sort of located in the lower part of the brain as opposed to the top of the brain. So where higher modes of thinking happen. So that's how the client starts engaging emotions and finally their mind. I've attended a few workshops with one Flame alum. Her name is Shravani Purandare. So I think she was your student as well, right? So she practices dance and movement therapy. Wow. Okay. Then there's Creative Movement Therapy Association of India, headed by Tripura Kashyap. She's very famous. She's given a bunch of TED Talks. This feels like it's my TED Talk about dance therapy. But okay, then there's the Yellow Oyster in Mumbai. So they're doing great work. And now just connecting this to the whole topic of new normal. we really need to see how therapies are evolving during the course of this pandemic. You would think that therapies that involve dance and movement, you would have to go physically visit the therapist, but that's not the case. The medium of therapy has also shifted to an online remote setup. And like we're looking elsewhere also, the gaps are being filled. Face to face care is now being replaced with telehealth, so where remote video and phone conferencing is taking place. So while these things are happening, it's also advisable to think critically about this situation, that we can maybe afford these therapies, but there are so many challenges and drawbacks that are also involved with remote therapies. The fact that sometimes people who may need it the most may not be able to avail these resources. Potential issues could be how maybe if people are technologically inadept, a lot of old people face problems with technology. Then even some people who may not be able to afford these kinds of therapies, then network issues and data services and things. So what I want you to think about is how, and even in digital technology, the question also arises about our digital identity, right? I'm very different in front of this screen, but I'm going to be very different in person. What about interpersonal communication? Right now you can't see if my leg is twitching or not. Maybe I am seeming confident and I'm not. Maybe I'm not confident and I'm seeming confident. So anyway, this whole setup is still a little impersonal. It may be the need of the hour, but what I want you to think about is that, is this adaptation a result of forced change? Where are we heading in terms of therapy, really, and how does the future look? Because it has been a year since this whole pandemic set in, and it feels like forever. But where are we really going? Do you think therapies are going to be now online only? And it's very, I have to say that online therapies are very, very convenient. But we have to think of both sides. Like Robin earlier also mentioned, we have to think of the pros and the cons. So maybe I would like to hear from you guys about where we're headed. And then I have a small activity exercise that I actually picked up from a workshop. So maybe after you guys talk, maybe we can end on that note.
I think that's absolutely very, very, important what you spoke about as to how the scene of therapy itself is evolving, and how do we look at that as a new normal. In fact, the fourth year student Isha Ahuja, if you know her, she's my mentee for the dissertation for her fourth year scholars program, and she's in fact picked up this very topic, and she's interviewing counselors and therapists. So we usually collect data from people, but she thought of taking a different perspective of trying to understand how counselors are adapting to this change. How many of them were able to translate and migrate to an online platform, what kind of training that they require for going for an online therapy perspective. Because in a traditional perspective, we say that about 70% of a communication happens non-verbally, and all those non-verbal cues, like you rightly said, get restricted, especially if you're talking to thumbnails. Then you don't have those cues. It is just the tone of voice, it's just the pauses that would probably help you understand, but beyond that you don't have major inputs coming in. So what kind of training would even be required for counselors? What kind of educational changes we'll have to make in the counseling program itself to be able to make online counseling or remote counseling as a part of a regular program. So if this becomes a new normal, like you're saying, if this is the way in which we are headed forward to, then that would also have to reflect somewhere in the curriculum and how counseling itself is taught and taken by the audience as well. So
I actually don't have anything to add. I think you pretty much summed it up all very well. And I think we should move on with the activity only, like if that's okay with everyone.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
Okay. So this activity I learned from another therapist. She was conducting a workshop, and it's a very simple thing. So I'm going to give a disclaimer. It's not something groundbreaking. Therapy takes a lot of time, and this is not a therapeutic practice. This is just a small exercise that you can do daily. So you would have heard of, Muskan spoke about meditation. Some people like to journal. Some people will like to talk to their friends or parents about it. So this is another small exercise that you can do, and you'll need to do it a couple of times to really understand. So this, for now, I would just request that don't try to, or like try not to justify what's happening, and try not to fight it right now. Just sit through, just experience. So Muskan, I wanted to add that earlier as well, that sometimes when we're trying new things as exercise or meditation, we're constantly thinking, Arey, how is this helping me? It's not doing anything. We can't see physical manifestations so quickly, right? It takes about month. Even exercise takes like 3 weeks to show. So for right now, let's just experience this, and it's a very small thing that we'll do. So I would, and I want the attendees to do this as well. I'm looking, I have this feature where I can look at the attendees, so I know if you're doing it or not. No, I'm joking. So I would request everybody, even Pallavi ma'am, if you can also try. So close your eyes. It will just take us about a minute or so.
Sure, Preeti.
Take a deep breath. I know you may have a lot of thoughts about this webinar, but try telling your mind that you will come to those thoughts in a bit. Right now, we're just going to do a very small practice, and we'll see how it goes. Take another deep breath for me. Now try to think about one memory in the past that made you really happy. It could be anything. It could be a picnic that you went with your friends in 5th grade. It could be the ice cream you ate yesterday. It could be submitting your assignment 1 second prior to the deadline. It could be anything. Just any memory that sparks joy. And now slowly float in that feeling, you know. Go back to that happy memory and stay there for a few seconds. How is it making you feel? You can smile if you want to, you can get up if you want to, is it making you feel free? It could be making you feel nothing, but that's fine. And float in it for just 5 more seconds. And whenever you're ready, open your eyes. So this is a small practice called savoring. And what you do is you go back to, there's a reason that those memories, you hold them, they make you feel happy. So it's just remembering one memory each day, and the practice goes this way, that you think of one new happy memory every day. So maybe at the end of 30 days you would say, hey, I have so many happy memories, and I have so much to look forward to. And I think in times of a pandemic, all we're looking for is hope, and this is just some small bit of hope that you can give to yourself.
This reminds me a bit of the gratitude journal, that kind of thing. But you have added the meditation bit to it, which is something that you then experience also. So that's, yeah, definitely a very good experience. I feel very, very relaxed right now. Even though we did it for
Absolutely,
like,
Rahul.
yeah.
Because generally we don't end up any webinar on this note. I mean, at least whatever I have been attending, not only on the Flame platform, but otherwise also. Preeti, thank you so much. I don't think we have ended up any webinar like this. I know we are towards the end, but maybe if you want to add up something before we take up. But Professor Sairaj, especially thanks to you, because I don't know. I mean, some participants here who have attended the last 1 or 2 webinars, what we have been doing. So this was especially arranged for a group of students who have successfully completed the selection process of FLAME in the recent past, and we thought that there is no opportunity for these students to meet these senior students who probably can narrate the stories so well. So when I was listening to Robin, or when I was listening to Preeti or Muskan for that matter, initially I thought, oh, there is no standard presentation, how Muskan will make it, how Preeti is going to take us through that 15-minute slot. But believe me, I mean, this has been my experience in the past also, when we did a webinar on economics, when we did a webinar on public policy. And every time I started thinking, oh, why we had no such education pattern by then when we probably graduated. And every webinar, I think that, oh, I could have done well in public policy. I could have done well in economics. I could have, now today I'm feeling, oh, why I did not study psychology, So the way these students are coming up with their experiences, or the way they're explaining certain concepts, or the way they are narrating stories. So especially Robin, when you started relating it to the home affairs, I think yes, all of us experienced that in the pandemic. I just need to go back to my family and announce the hierarchy, by the way, which I'll do it today evening. But I think all of us experienced that, but nobody could relate to the concepts what we study in the classroom session. So I think you are coming in from that and trying to relate it. I think it's a big skill what you people have got, because at times people takes years in the industries to relate to their classroom sessions. I have seen that in the past couple of years experience, and have seen so many colleagues, peers, juniors, seniors, but people sometimes just go randomly in their operations. But the kind of theories, kind of classroom sessions which you're relating it to the day-to-day operations, day-to-day life, I think it's really amazing, really amazing. I enjoyed this session a lot, especially hearing Robin, hearing Muskan, and certain psychology effects of some colors, or maybe Preeti taking us through that 1 minute, 2 minutes journey. I think it's wonderful. God bless you all. Really, I'm amazed. Thank you so much, Professor Sairaj, for bringing this
Thank you
group
so much.
together.
Thank you to these 3 wonderful students. Actually, all credit goes to them. And really looking forward to meeting all the attendees. Some really nice questions, and apologies if we weren't able to answer some of them. But we look forward to a wonderful discussion whenever we meet, across lunch, across breakfast in Flame. We keep talking on what we call as the academic spine, be it by the Kund. While having chai, there are discussions between all of us as peers, and everybody passionate about the subject. It's not about the hierarchy. So it's not about an organization in that sense. I think it's about just being passionate about learning about life. Not, as I said, it's not about psychology. It's not about one subject. It's about being prepared for life. And that's something, if I could learn as being part of it as a faculty, I think the students must be having a wonderful time. So thank you for all of you for being here. And thank you, Pallavi ma'am, for arranging.